Welcome to Legends of America, American History, written by Doug Richardson, narrated by Calvin T. Hartung. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.
Chapter 1. Columbus and the Discovery of the Americas. From the earliest times, there were trade routes over land between Europe and Asia. During the Middle Ages, the traffic on these routes increased greatly, so that by the 15th century, a large and profitable trade was carried on between the West and the East. Merchants in Western Europe grew rich through trade in silks, spices, and precious stones that were brought by caravans and ships from India, China, and Japan. However, in 1453, the Turks conquered Constantinople, and by frequent attacks on Christian vessels in the Mediterranean, made the old routes unsafe. A more practical route became necessary. In the early part of the 15th century, Portuguese sea captains had skirted the western coast of Africa. By the end of the century, others had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, searching for a water route to the Indies. But Spain, at that time the most powerful nation in Europe, adopted a plan quite different from that of the Portuguese. What this plan was and how it was carried out, we can best understand by an acquaintance with the life and work of the great sea captain and navigator, Christopher Columbus. More than 450 years ago, there lived in the city of Genoa a poor working man who made his living by preparing wool for the spinners. Of his 4 sons, the eldest was Christopher, born in 1436. Young Christopher was not, so far as we know, very different from most other boys in Genoa. He doubtless joined in their everyday sports, going with them to see the many vessels that sailed in and out of that famous seaport, and listening for hours to the stories of sailors about distant lands. But he did not spend all his time playing and visiting the wharves, for we know that he learned his father's trade, and in school studied, among other things, reading, arithmetic, grammar, geography, and map drawing. We can easily believe that he liked geography best of all, since it would carry his imagination far out over the sea and to lands beyond the sea. In map drawing he acquired such skill that when he became a man, he could earn his living, when occasion demanded, by making maps and charts. Little is known about the boyhood and youth of Columbus, but it is likely that he spent much of his early life at sea, sailing on the Mediterranean and along the west coast of Africa. He even ventured as far north as England, and possibly beyond. During his many voyages, Columbus heard tales of the Portuguese sailors and their discoveries, as Portugal was one of the greatest sea powers of the time. Columbus, at the age of about 35, settled in Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, where his brother Bartholomew lived, and where many seafarers congregated. Columbus was a man of imposing stature, with a ruddy complexion and piercing blue-gray eyes. By the age of 30, his hair had turned white and fell in wavy locks about his shoulders. Despite his life of hardship and poverty, he carried himself with the air of a gentleman, and his manners were pleasing and courteous. Columbus possessed a strong will that enabled him to overcome obstacles that would have defeated most men. While in Lisbon, Columbus married a woman of higher social standing and moved with her to the Madeiras, where her family had business interests. Columbus spent his time on the island contemplating schemes for a future voyage to the Far East. His native city, Genoa, had grown wealthy trading in the silks, spices, and precious stones of the Indies, but the overland journey was perilous, and a water route was highly desired. The Portuguese, like the rest of Europe, felt this need, and Portuguese sea captains had been slowly but surely finding their way down the west coast of Africa in search of a passage around the southern Cape. This route would be easier and cheaper than the old one through the Mediterranean and across Asia. However, Columbus conceived of a more daring course, one that involved sailing directly west from the Canary Islands, across the Atlantic Ocean, with the expectation of discovering the far-famed Indies. In the mind of Columbus, there was but one great idea, one grand vision that consumed his every thought. He dreamed of a water route that would safely bring the wealth of the East to the doors of Europe, a discovery that would be the greatest of the age. His ambition was fueled by the thrilling tales of Marco Polo, a noted traveler who, 2 centuries before, had returned from far-off China with stories of golden palaces, marble bridges spanning marvelous rivers, and countless treasures of gold, silver, and jewels. Around the year 1484, Columbus presented his scheme to King John of Portugal, but the king refused to promise his assistance. Instead, he borrowed hints from Columbus's charts and sent his own men to test the waters of the Western Sea. But the sailors, met with stormy weather and fearing the unknown expanse of the ocean, soon returned to port with news that there was no land to be seen. Columbus was indignant when he learned of the king's actions and left Portugal for Spain, with little hope of finding a helping friend. He took his young son Diego, just 4 or 5 years old, and trudged wearily on his journey, eventually leaving Diego in the care of his aunt near Palos. Columbus then set out to find King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. At the time, the king and queen were preoccupied with driving the Moors out of Spain, and Columbus struggled to secure a hearing. When he was finally permitted to present his plans to a council of learned men, they ridiculed him. They found his assertion that the world was round like a globe, and that people lived on the opposite side of the earth to be absurd. "Such a thing," they declared, "is impossible. If people live on the other side of the earth, their heads must be down. And if it rains there, the rain falls upward. Trees, if they grow there, must grow upside down." Some doubted the vision of Columbus, dismissing him as a madman or a worthless wanderer. But there were also learned men who saw the potential for honor and wealth that lay in his plan, and they stood by him. Alas, their influence was not enough to sway the skeptics. Despite the scorn and ridicule he faced, Columbus refused to abandon his dream. He followed the Spanish monarchs as they waged war, fighting alongside them and seeking their support. But even the children in the streets mocked him, pointing and laughing as he passed. In the autumn of 1491, Columbus decided to leave Spain and seek his fortune in France. He set out on foot with his son Diego, his clothes worn and his hair long and white. After a short distance, they stopped at the convent of St. Mary to beg for bread and water. It was there that Columbus met the prior, a learned man who was intrigued by his story. The prior arranged a meeting with other scholars, including the renowned sea captain Martin Alonso Pinzon. Pinzon was so taken with Columbus's plans that he not only promised to fund an expedition, but also to join it himself. And so, with the support of a few faithful friends, Columbus set out to discover a new world. In addition, the prior, who had served as Isabella's confessor, managed to persuade her to support Columbus's cause. The Queen sent Columbus what would now be nearly $1,200 and summoned him back to court. Columbus, with a mule and suitable clothing, made his way to the Queen's presence with a lightened heart. Although she approved his plan, Columbus demanded such a great reward for his services as leader of the expedition that the Queen refused to come to any agreement with him and let him go. Disgusted, Columbus mounted his mule and started for France. However, one of the Queen's advisers urgently presented the case to her, and she sent a swift courier, who caught up with Columbus in a nearby mountain pass and brought him back. An agreement was soon reached, and Columbus accepted his commission with tears of joy. He immediately went to Palos to obtain men and vessels for the expedition. However, he encountered serious difficulties. Sailors referred to the Atlantic Ocean as the Sea of Darkness, and believed that it contained frightful sea monsters that would destroy any vessel that came within reach. Furthermore, we must remember that the vessels of those days were not as safe as the great ships of our time against storms. Venturing out onto this trackless sea meant almost certain death to sailors. Therefore, they were reluctant to sail, and a royal decree had to be issued to compel them. Even then, it became necessary to release criminals from prisons to provide the required number for the expedition. The 3 caravels that were finally prepared for the perilous westward expedition in search of the Indies were not larger than many of today's fishing boats. The flagship of Columbus, the Santa Maria, was the largest of the 3. The other 2 were the Pinta and the Nina, or Baby. Only the Santa Maria had a deck covering the entire hold of the vessel. At last, all was prepared. A half-hour before sunrise on the morning of Friday, August the 3rd, 1492, The fleet set sail from the port of Palos. 120 men, along with provisions for a year, embarked on this journey. For the sailors, it was a sorrowful hour, as they believed they would never see their homes or loved ones again. Columbus steered the fleet towards the Canaries, where they stayed for 3 weeks to repair the rudder of the Pinta. On September the 6th, they set sail once more. Once out of sight of land, the sailors were overcome with fear and cried and sobbed like children. But their fears were not over. After a week, the compass needle no longer pointed to the North Star, which filled the superstitious sailors with alarm. Their consternation only grew when they entered vast stretches of seaweed a few days later. At first, the fleet easily plowed through the mass of floating green, but after 3 days, a light wind caused the vessels to move more slowly. The sailors feared that the vessels might never get through this immense sea of grass, or worse, run upon rocks and shoals lying just beneath the grass and be broken in pieces. Despite the obstacles, they were in the path of the trade winds that steadily bore them onward. However, in their terror, the sailors imagined they could never return, because the wind would not allow them to sail in the opposite direction. When the wind began to blow from the southwest, they were once more relieved of their fears. After many days, the sight of birds gladdened all hearts, indicating that land was near. However, it was an idle hope. Again and again some eager-eyed sailor shouted land, only to find out later that they were looking at distant clouds. The crew was in a state of despair. They were caught in the belt of trade winds, which were blowing them further and further away from their home and loved ones. They cried out in dismay, "We can never return to Spain. We are lost. What shall we do?" They begged Columbus to turn back, but when he refused, they became angry and declared him crazy, accusing him of leading them to their destruction. They even plotted to throw him overboard one night and claimed that he fell into the sea while stargazing. Columbus knew that danger was closing in on him, but he never wavered in his purpose. His strong will and unwavering faith in success kept him steadfast in the face of difficulties that would have caused an ordinary mind to crumble. On October the 11th, unmistakable signs of land appeared. A thorn branch with berries, a reed, and a carved stick came floating by. New life stirred in every heart, and the sailors eagerly searched in every direction for land. The king and queen had promised a reward equal to nearly $600 of our present money to the sailor who would be the first to see land. Columbus had promised a velvet cloak in addition. Everyone was on the lookout to catch the first glimpse of land, and kept watch throughout the night after the appearance of the thorn branch and carved stick. Around 10 o'clock, Columbus himself saw a light in the distance, which looked like a torch in the hands of someone moving along the shore. Around 2 o'clock the next morning, Friday, October the 12th, or October the 21st, according to our present method of reckoning time, a sailor on the Pinta saw a low strip of land about 5 miles away. This was an island of the Bahama group. Just 10 weeks had passed since the voyage began in Palos, and with intense eagerness, Columbus and his men awaited the coming of daylight. At the break of dawn, the boats were lowered and all disembarked onto the shore. Columbus, adorned in a luxurious scarlet robe, carried the royal standard. His companions also held banners, each displaying a bright green cross with the letters F and Y, the Spanish initials for Ferdinand and Isabella on either side. Above the letters were crosses. Columbus fell to his knees and wept tears of joy as he kissed the earth, taking possession of the land in the name of the King and Queen of Spain. The sailors followed suit, falling to their knees at Columbus's feet, kissing his hands, and begging for forgiveness for their previous ill thoughts towards him. Initially, the natives, whom Columbus referred to as Indians, because he believed he was in the East Indies, fled to the woods in fear of the Spaniards. However, they later returned and worshipped the white men as celestial beings. They believed the vessels were enormous birds, and the sails were wings. The Spaniards immediately began trading with the Indians, exchanging trifles such as tiny bells, red caps, and glass beads for tame parrots, cotton yarn, and a few small gold ornaments worn by the natives on their noses. According to Columbus's journal, the natives were very impoverished, dark-skinned and unclothed. They all appeared to be young and robust, with coarse black hair that hung long behind them but was cut short over their foreheads. Their bodies were painted in various colors and designs. The men carried sticks pointed with fish bones as javelins, and propelled their canoes with paddles resembling wooden shovels. The canoes, constructed from single tree trunks, were large enough to accommodate up to 40 men in some cases. The dwellings, clustered in groups of 12 to 15, were tent-shaped and had tall chimneys. Inside the tents, nets called hammocks were hung between posts and used as beds. In 1492, Columbus set foot upon an island which he named San Salvador, or Holy Savior. The beauty of this new land was so great that Columbus was at a loss as to where to begin exploring. The verdant foliage was a sight to behold, and the birds sang so sweetly that one could not bear to leave. Parrots flew in flocks so large that they obscured the sun, and other birds of all shapes and sizes, unlike any Columbus had ever seen, filled the air. The trees were equally wondrous, each bearing its own unique fruit of incredible flavor. Columbus continued his journey along the coasts of Cuba and Hispaniola, stopping here and there to send parties inland to learn more about the land and its people. He was always on the lookout for the fabled cities of Asia, described in such vivid detail by Marco Polo. Columbus never doubted that he had found the East Indies. On Christmas morning of that same year, as Columbus sailed along the shores of Hispaniola, the Santa Maria ran aground on a sandbar. The waves soon destroyed the ship, and with the Pinta having already deserted, only one ship remained, the Nina. Unfortunately, the Nina was too small to carry all of the men, so 40 of them decided to stay behind and build a fort out of the wreckage. They used the ship's guns to defend themselves and had enough provisions to last a year. These men became the first Spanish colony in the New World. On January the 4th, 1493, the Nina set sail for Spain. All was well until February the 12th, when a fierce storm threatened to destroy the fragile vessel. Columbus feared that he and his men would perish at sea, their great achievement unknown to the world. On parchment, the anxious explorer wrote 2 separate accounts of his discovery, which he sealed and addressed to Ferdinand and Isabella. He then wrapped each in cloth and enclosed them in large cakes of wax, putting them into barrels. One barrel he flung into the sea, and the other he kept on deck. The Nina safely passed through the storm, and on March the 15th, after an absence of nearly 7.5 months, cast anchor in the harbor of Palos. The triumphant voyager wasted no time in reaching Barcelona, where he was received by the king and queen with great honors. Everyone was eager to praise the man who had become so famous. A grand procession was held in his honor in the streets of Barcelona. Leading the parade were 6 Indians whom Columbus had brought back with him. They were painted, adorned with feathers of tropical birds, and decorated with bits of gold. Following them were men carrying stuffed and live birds of brilliant plumage, as well as the skins of different animals, all products of the New World. Columbus rode on horseback, accompanied by many of Spain's great men, also mounted on horses. When the procession reached the house where King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were, Columbus entered the room where they sat on the throne. They rose in his honor, and when he knelt to kiss their hands, they again honored him by bidding him to rise and sit, like an equal, in their presence. The once despised sailor, who was once considered an idle dreamer, had become a distinguished personage, honored by kings, princes, and people alike. It was no longer necessary to force men by royal decree to sail with the great admiral. Many were now eager to go where they might reap wealth and honor. In September 1493, Columbus set sail again, this time with a fleet of 17 vessels and 1,500 men. Many of the latter were young men of noble birth, belonging to families of great influence. All believed they were going to the East Indies, the land of jewels, spices, and precious metals. With the intention of founding a colony, Columbus took with him not only horses, mules, and cattle, but also vines, vegetables, and seeds of many kinds. When the fleet arrived at the island of Haiti, where Columbus had left a small colony of 40 men the previous winter, he discovered that the fort and provisions had been destroyed, and 11 corpses had been buried nearby. However, none of the 40 men were ever seen alive again. Columbus then built a little town called Isabella in honor of the Queen and began exploring by land and sea. He found many beautiful and interesting things, but also many disappointments. Additionally, the Indians were sometimes unfriendly, and his own men were often unruly and treacherous. After 4 years of varying fortune, Columbus started his journey home. After a long, hard voyage during which provisions ran out, he and his men, weak with hunger, finally reached Spain in June. He was kindly received and promised more ships for another voyage. In May of 1498, Columbus set out on a third voyage with 6 vessels and 200 men besides the sailors. This time he directed his course more to the south than before. He landed on an island which he named Trinidad, and then sailed along the northern coast of South America. However, Columbus was not well, and in August he turned his course for Santo Domingo, where he found that things were going badly. Trouble with the Indians had arisen, and even more serious trouble in the colony itself had broken out. Columbus struggled for 2 years to set things right, but he was not successful as a colonizer. Moreover, many people were beginning to lose faith in him because he did not get expected treasures for Spain. Many others were jealous of his fame and plotted to ruin him. Eventually, an official was sent from Spain to Haiti to investigate the situation. When he arrived on the island, he confiscated Columbus's property, put him in chains, and sent him as a prisoner to the country from which he had but recently sailed with high honor. In Spain, the people sympathized with the admiral in his disgrace, as did the Queen, who sent money and summoned him to court. She received him there with tears in her eyes, and he broke down and wept at her feet. In 1502, Christopher Columbus embarked on his 4th voyage, charting a course along the eastern shores of Central America. Alas, his efforts were met with little success, and he eventually met with disaster, his shipwrecked vessel marooned upon the island of Jamaica. There he languished for a year, beset by misery and misfortune. At long last, Columbus set sail for his homeland, arriving only a short time before the passing of his sole benefactor, Queen Isabella. Poor, ailing, and disheartened, he eked out a meager existence for a further 18 months, until his death on May the 20th, 1506. Tragically, he passed from this world in utter ignorance of the magnitude of his discovery. So little was Columbus appreciated in his time that the annals of the city made no mention of his passing. It fell to future generations to rescue his name from obscurity, and to offer due recognition for his contributions to the advancement of human progress. Chapter 2. Hernando de Soto and the Discovery of the Mississippi. After Columbus discovered the New World, the Spaniards, convinced that he had found a new route to India, were consumed with dreams of its fabulous riches, and eager to set sail for the land where they believed fortunes awaited them. So fervent were they in their mad quest for gold and adventure that many were willing to leave home and friends for years. The most illustrious of these explorers were Cortez, the conqueror of Mexico, and Pizarro, the conqueror of Peru, both of whom returned to Spain with millions of dollars worth of gold and silver. With Pizarro was a young man named Hernando de Soto, whose adventurous life is replete with interest, and whose momentous discovery of the Mississippi River has earned him a prominent place in the annals of our country. De Soto was born around 1500 into a poor but noble family. In his youth, he excelled in athletic sports and possessed extraordinary skill in horsemanship and fencing. Taking a leading role in all the perilous exploits in the New World, he not only won fame, but also returned to Spain after many years' absence a wealthy man. While Cortez and Pizarro were conquering Mexico and Peru, other Spaniards were seeking their fortune in Florida. Although these men had not yet brought back any gold or silver, their faith in the mines of the interior was so unshakable that De Soto wished to conquer and explore the country. Having already gained great influence through his achievements, he won the favor of the king, who appointed him governor of the island of Cuba and leader of an expedition to conquer and occupy Florida. He was to take enough men with him to build forts and establish a colony, thereby securing the country for Spain. De Soto had no trouble finding followers to join him in this enterprise. Young men from noble families flocked to his banner from all parts of Spain, and knowing that dangers and hardships awaited them, He was careful to select only the strongest men from among the throngs. The company of De Soto was a sight to behold, with nobles and warriors bedecked in shining armor and fine garments. They set sail from the port with great fanfare, banners waving and cannons booming. Every young man aboard felt a sense of pride to be part of such a grand expedition. After spending some time in Cuba, De Soto left his wife in charge and ventured forth to explore Florida. His expedition was a formidable one, with 9 vessels, 600 men, and 225 horses. In May of 1539, they landed at Tampa Bay on the western coast of Florida. Their journey into the interior was soon interrupted when De Soto encountered a fellow Spaniard named Ortiz. Ortiz had accompanied Narvaez on a previous expedition 10 or 11 years prior and had been captured by the Indians. They spared his life at the request of an Indian girl, and he had lived among them ever since. Ortiz was overjoyed to see his fellow countrymen, and the Spaniards were equally pleased to have a guide and interpreter. However, De Soto's mistreatment of the Indians soon negated any advantage gained from Ortiz's presence. He showed no concern for their well-being, and even took pleasure in torturing and killing them. Upon arriving at an Indian settlement, he demanded food for his men and horses, and took the head chief as a guide and hostage upon departure, not releasing him until they reached the next tribe. Indian men and women were forced into servitude as porters for the Spanish baggage, often with chains and iron collars around their necks. The Indians lost all trust in De Soto and the Spaniards, and they sought revenge for the cruelties inflicted upon them. They purposely led the Spaniards astray and used every treacherous means at their disposal to destroy the pale-faced strangers. In May, 1540, an Indian princess, rowed by her loyal followers in a canopied canoe, glided across a stream to meet the great De Soto. When she stepped ashore, her devoted followers carried her in a litter, from which she gracefully descended and approached the Spanish explorer. She bestowed upon him gifts of shawls and skins, and a string of pearls which she removed from around her neck. In return for her kindness, De Soto repaid her with treachery, making her his captive and forcing her to travel on foot with him until she managed to escape. This is just one example of the ruthless behavior that turned the indigenous people against the Spanish invaders. No doubt Indian messengers were dispatched for hundreds of miles in all directions to spread the word of the white men's inhumanity. It is likely that these tribes joined forces in a desperate attempt to destroy De Soto and his men. The outcome of their efforts can be summed up in just a few lines. In the autumn of 1540, the Spaniards arrived at the territory of a giant chieftain whose slaves held over him, as he sat upon cushions on a raised platform, a buckskin umbrella stained red and white. He was sullen in the presence of the richly dressed Spaniards on their prancing steeds, but allowed De Soto to take him prisoner to the next Indian town, as other head chiefs had done before him. This town was called Mavilla, an Indian word from which we derive the name Mobile for the city and river in Alabama. As the Spaniards approached the town, they were met by a group of Indians whose faces displayed signs of displeasure and ill intent. Undaunted, De Soto, accompanied by about a dozen of his men, rode boldly into the town, which was surrounded by a palisade. The great chieftain requested permission to return to his own people, but when his request was denied, he sought refuge in a house where many Indian warriors were hiding. De Soto demanded that he come out, but the chieftain refused. In the ensuing chaos, a Spaniard struck down an Indian warrior with his sword. This act of violence incited hundreds of warriors to charge out of the house in a frenzied attack. They quickly killed 5 of De Soto's bodyguards. De Soto was forced to flee for his life, but he was struck by Indian arrows several times before he could reach the main force outside the town. This skirmish marked the beginning of a brutal battle. Although the Spaniards were outnumbered, they had the upper hand due to their horses, swords, firearms, and superior training. Eventually they closed the gates to the town from the outside and set fire to the Indian buildings. The Indians fought with desperation, but they were either cut down by Spanish swords or perished in the flames. When night fell, only 3 Indian warriors remained alive. 2 of them fought until they were killed, and the last one hanged himself on a tree with his bowstring. The Spaniards claimed to have killed at least 2,500 Indians, but they lost about a third of their own number in killed and wounded. It was a costly victory. The Spaniards faced other challenges besides Indian aggression. They had to navigate through dense forests with no roads, except for the narrow paths created by wild animals or Indian hunters. They spent many arduous days hacking their way through thick underbrush and muddy swamps, pausing occasionally to construct rafts to cross the numerous streams. Often starving and without food, they were forced to eat native dogs and subsist on berries, nuts, bear oil, and wild honey. Despite hunger, disease, death, and many other misfortunes, however, the intrepid explorer De Soto, in his mad search for gold, threaded his way through the tangled forests, until, in the spring of 1541, about 2 years after landing at Tampa Bay, he reached the bank of the Mississippi River on foot. After spending months making boats, he finally crossed the mighty stream, and then continued his march in a northerly and westerly direction, going, it would seem, as far as the site of what is now Little Rock, the capital of Arkansas. Marching southeast, probably to the banks of the Washita, he spent a winter so severe that many of the party, including Ortiz, died. About the middle of April 1542, the Spaniards, travel spent and sick at heart, reached the mouth of the Red River, where De Soto, discouraged and broken in spirit, was took ill with fever, and soon died. At first his followers buried his body near the town where they were staying, but when the Indians began to examine the ground under which he lay, the Spaniards in the darkness of night took up the body, wrapped it in blankets made heavy with sand, and lowered it into the waters of the mighty river which it was De Soto's chief honor to have discovered. After many more hardships, the wretched survivors of this unhappy company, numbering not many more than half of those who landed at Tampa Bay, found their way to a Spanish colony in Mexico. Thus ended in disaster the expedition which sailed with such hope of wealth and renown. Chapter 3. Sir Walter Raleigh and the First English Attempts to Colonize America. 5 years after Columbus's discoveries in the West Indies, John Cabot set sail from England in search of a shortcut to Asia through the northwest. He directed his course across the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean, and landed somewhere on the eastern coast of North America, possibly on the shores of Labrador. The following year, his son sailed along the coast from Nova Scotia down to North Carolina. These discoveries and explorations led England to claim North America. Nearly a century passed before England took any further steps toward establishing a foothold in America. Meanwhile, Spain, with her naval power, had conquered Mexico and Peru and established colonies at various points in the New World. The precious metals collected by Spanish explorers in Mexico and Peru provided the money that enabled Spain to carry out her expeditions and almost continuous wars with other European powers. Some believe that Spain took out of these two countries gold and silver worth $5 billion today. At that time, England did not have as strong a navy as she does today, and the Spanish king hoped to conquer England and make her a dependency of Spain because of her weakness. This, of course, roused the English people, and they resolved to thwart the Spanish king's ambitious schemes. Although England did not have a fighting navy, English seamen were vigilant in capturing Spanish vessels and robbing them of their gold and silver. To seize these prizes, bold sea captains like Drake and Hawkins roamed the sea, burning and plundering Spanish fleets and settlements along the coast of Mexico and South America. Sir Walter Raleigh was one of the most distinguished Englishmen of his time, and a conspicuous figure among these daring sea rovers and explorers. He was born in a town near the Devonshire seacoast in 1552, and his father and mother were both of high social rank. In this town lived many an old salt, who could spin yarns of seafaring life and bloody brawls with the Spaniards that'd make any young lad's eyes go wide. Young Walter was a patriotic lad, and so he learned to despise Spain for her insolence towards the English folk. As he grew older and learned more about Spain's power, especially in the New World, he longed for his country to be Spain's equal in riches. When Walter was of age, he was sent to Oxford University, where he became a diligent scholar. But at 17, he set aside his books and sailed off to France to join the Huguenots, the French Protestants, who were then at war with the Catholics. After 6 years there, he returned to England and fought for a spell in the English army against Spain and Austria in the Netherlands. Later, he led 100 men as captain to Ireland, where he proved himself a brave warrior. Back in England, Raleigh won the admiration of the powerful Queen Elizabeth with a simple act of chivalry. One day, when she and her attendants were about to cross a muddy road, Raleigh saw her hesitate for a moment. Quick as a flash, he took off his fine velvet cloak and laid it down in her path. The Queen was so pleased with this gallant gesture that she brought Raleigh into her court and bestowed upon him many honors. She made him a knight, gave him valuable gifts and estates, and bestowed upon him high offices of rank and dignity. Sir Walter Raleigh became a man of great wealth and influence. As a courtier, Raleigh dressed in rich and dazzling attire. He wore a hat with a band of pearls and a black feather studded with jewels. His shoes, tied with white ribbons, were worth 6,600 gold pieces. He even had a suit of silver armor that sparkled with diamonds and other precious stones. In those days, grandeur was customary in court life, and this splendor did not seem out of place. Queen Elizabeth, with her 1,075 dresses and mantles adorned with lace, embroidery, and jewels, and her 80 wigs of various colors, set a magnificent example that her courtiers were eager to follow. Raleigh, however, was not content with the glamour of court life. He was determined to bring glory to England, and, if possible, elevate her above her enemy Spain. Raleigh desired to establish a New England for the glory of the old, and to that end he obtained a charter from Queen Elizabeth to plant a colony in America. He outfitted 2 vessels to sail to the land north of Florida, then occupied by Spain, and bring back reports of the country. The captains of these vessels arrived in Pamlico Sound, and landed on an island rich in grapes and woods, and abundant in deer and other game. The explorers received kind treatment from the Indians, 2 of whom accompanied the voyagers to England on their return. Queen Elizabeth was so pleased with the good reports from the new country that she named it Virginia in honor of herself, the Virgin Queen. The following year, in 1585, Raleigh sent 7 vessels and 100 colonists to Virginia under his cousin, Sir Richard Grenville, and Ralph Lane. They settled on Roanoke Island, but the colony was not prosperous. At the outset, they made enemies of the natives through unwise and cruel treatment. It is said that when an Indian stole a silver cup from one of the colonists, the Englishmen burned an entire village and ruined the corn belonging to its people. Such punishment was disproportionate to the petty offense, and it is not surprising that from that time the settlers found the Indians unfriendly. Grenville sailed back to England, leaving Ralph Lane in charge of the colony. But instead of building homes and tilling the soil for food, the colonists were consumed with the desire to find gold. They eagerly listened to the Indians' tale of the Roanoke River, which supposedly flowed near rich mines of gold and silver, in a land with walls made of pearls. The river was said to flow out of a fountain in a rock so close to the ocean that during storms the waves would crash into the fountain. Lane and his followers foolishly set out to find this mythical land, despite the many difficulties they encountered, including hostile Indian attacks and a severe lack of food that forced them to eat their own dogs. Despite these hardships, they eventually made their way back to Roanoke Island just in time to save the colony from destruction by the Indians. Shortly thereafter, Sir Francis Drake arrived with a fleet of 23 vessels, having just plundered Spanish settlements in the West Indies. He agreed to take the destitute and homesick colonists back to England. A few days after their departure, Grenville arrived with fresh supplies, only to find the settlement deserted. He left a garrison of 15 men with provisions for 2 years to hold possession, and then sailed back to England. Although the colony ultimately failed, it was not entirely without success. The colonists brought back 3 products that gave the people of England a new perspective on the wealth of the new lands: tobacco, the white potato, and Indian corn. The discovery of the tobacco plant introduced the custom of smoking to England, and a curious story is told of Sir Walter Raleigh, who quickly learned to smoke. One day his slave, who knew nothing of the new custom, walked into Raleigh's room and found him smoking from a silver pipe. Believing Raleigh was on fire, the faithful slave quickly threw a mug of ale at him to put out the flames and save him from death. The riches that lay hidden in the soil were yet undiscovered, and no one felt any excitement over the new colony of Virginia. Most men would have lost hope by this time, but Raleigh was not discouraged. 2 years later, he made a second attempt to establish a colony in the New World. This time, he sent 3 ships with 150 settlers, including 17 women. John White was appointed as the governor of the colony. These settlers had the foresight to bring farming tools to till the soil. When they landed on Roanoke Island, they found no trace of the 15 men left there 2 years before by Sir Richard Grenville. The new settlers needed help from England soon after their arrival, and begged Governor White to return home for provisions and more settlers. White initially refused to leave them, but he finally consented. His love for his little granddaughter, born soon after the settlers arrived, and his warm interest in the feeble settlement persuaded him to yield. This little girl, the first white girl born in America, was named after the new country, Virginia. Her full name was Virginia Dare. When Governor White left the settlement, he expected to return immediately. However, upon reaching England, he found his countrymen greatly excited over the coming invasion of the much-dreaded Spanish Armada. Everyone was astir, and Raleigh was fully engaged in preparing to meet the hated foe. But despite this, he found time to equip 2 small vessels for Governor White. Although they sailed, trouble with the Spaniards forced their return to England. Not until 2 years later, when the Spanish Armada had been defeated, did Governor White sail again for Virginia, this time as a passenger in a West Indiaman. He landed on Roanoke Island as before, but there remained of the settlement only some chests of books, some maps, and some firearms, all of which had been ruined by the Indians. As Governor White bid farewell to the colonists, they agreed to carve the name of their destination on a tree in case they decided to leave Roanoke Island. They also agreed to carve a cross above the name if they were in serious trouble. Governor White found the word Croatoan carved in capital letters on a large tree, but he found no cross. Before White could sail to Croatoan, which was a nearby island, he had to return to England because the captain of the vessel refused to sail further due to stormy weather. The fate of the lost colonists remains a mystery, but it is possible that the Indians either killed or enslaved them. Raleigh sent out other expeditions in search of the lost colony, but they were unsuccessful. He had already spent a sum equal to more than $1 million in trying to establish this colony, and he felt that he must give up all hope of accomplishing his purpose. However, this was only one of Raleigh's many disappointments. As a favorite of the Queen and a successful man, he had many enemies who were jealous of his good fortune. Men of power envied him and tried to weaken his influence and harm him. As his failures increased, his popularity diminished, and he eventually became bitter in spirit. Upon the death of Queen Elizabeth, James I became king, and not favoring Raleigh, threw him into prison on a charge of treason. After 12 years of imprisonment in the Tower of London, Sir Walter was beheaded. Just as he was about to lay his head upon the block, he felt the keen edge of the axe, saying, "This is a sharp medicine, but a sound cure for all diseases." Although he failed to carry out the great desire of his heart, Raleigh gave the English people some definite ideas regarding the value of the New World as a place for colonizing. Ideas which found expression in the settlement of Jamestown. Chapter 4. John Smith and the Settlement of Jamestown. In the year 1607, some 20 years after Sir Walter Raleigh's failed attempt to establish a colony in the New World, a group of wealthy merchants known as the London Company set out on a mission to discover gold, a precious metal that had captured the imagination of the English people, much like it had the Spanish before them, who sailed under the leadership of Columbus, Pizarro, Cortez, and De Soto. The London Company sent out 105 men, who set sail from London on New Year's Day, in the year of our Lord, 1607, aboard 3 frail vessels. These men were not the sturdy, self-reliant types that give strength to a new enterprise. Instead, about half of them were gentlemen, who felt themselves above working with their hands. They were coming to America to pick up a fortune, and then return to England to live at ease for the rest of their lives. As we shall see, such colonists were unfit for the rough and rugged life which awaited them in the wild woods of a new country. Rather than sailing straight across the Atlantic, they took a much longer route, directing their course down the coast of France and Spain to the Canaries, and from these islands to the West Indies. Here they stopped for a long time, and as a result, they were about 4 months on the tiresome voyage and had used up nearly all their provisions before reaching their journey's end. This was just the beginning of their troubles. Their purpose had been to land on the deserted site of Raleigh's colony, Roanoke Island, but a violent storm had driven them off course, and they entered the Chesapeake Bay, naming the headlands on either side Cape Charles and Cape Henry after the king's sons. Pushing on, they found a quiet harbor which they fittingly called Point Comfort. After resting here, they sailed up the river and named it the James, after James I, King of England. The voyagers were delighted with the country, for it was the month of May, and the banks of the river were luxuriant with beautiful trees, shrubbery, and many-colored flowers. 50 miles from the mouth of the James, the voyagers landed on a peninsula, which they chose as the place of settlement because it was within easy reach of the sea. They wasted no time in constructing homes and a fortress to protect themselves from hostile Native Americans. Initially, their dwellings were crude cabins with roofs made of sage or bark, tents fashioned from old sails, and holes dug into the ground. Their first church was covered with an old sail, and a plank between 2 trees served as the pulpit. Establishing their church early on proved to be a wise decision, as they soon required its solace. The sweltering heat of July and August, and the humid air hovering over the swamps and marshes bred disease, causing many colonists to fall ill with fever. On occasion, 3 or 4 would perish in a single night. To exacerbate matters, food was scarce, and each settler's daily ration was reduced to a half pint of moldy wheat and barley. As if these afflictions from the climate, meager sustenance, contaminated water, and loss of loved ones were not enough, the Native Americans kept the miserable settlers in constant fear for their lives. Each man had to take his turn every 3rd night, lying on the damp, bare ground to watch for attacks, even though there were not 5 men strong enough to carry guns at times. Their plight was indeed pitiable. Those in good health were insufficient to care for the sick. During the summer, approximately half of the settlers perished. All would have perished if not for the bravery and strength of one man, John Smith, who kept the struggling colony alive for several years through his authority and wise treatment of the Native Americans. Born in England in 1579, he was 28 years old when Jamestown was established. As a boy, he was orphaned and apprenticed to a trade, but his yearning for adventure led him to run away and seek his fortune on the continent.